In July 2019, a former Amazon engineer exploited a misconfiguration in a Capital One web application firewall to make a specific type of request the firewall should have blocked. The request reached the EC2 metadata service, an internal AWS endpoint that returns configuration data about the instance, including the temporary credentials for any IAM role attached to it. The EC2 instance had an IAM role. The role had broad S3 permissions. The temporary credentials came back. She used them to access and download data on more than 100 million Capital One customers. The IAM role was correctly assigned. The metadata service worked as designed. The credentials it returned were valid and legitimate. No permission was misconfigured to produce that outcome. The problem was not what the role was assigned to. The problem was what the role could be reached from, and that what it could be reached from was, in practice, anything capable of making a request through that EC2 instance. Permissions are assigned to specific identities. They do not stay there. In every computing environment, permissions propagate from their point of assignment to wherever the holding entity operates, and from there to whatever other entities that entity can reach. The chain between the original assignment and the permission's current location is almost never documented, rarely traced, and in most systems not visible at all without deliberate effort. Transitive access. An entity holds transitive access when it holds permissions not because they were explicitly granted to it, but because it is positioned at the receiving end of a propagation chain from an entity that was. Transitive access is not a misconfiguration. It is a structural property of how permissions move through systems. The most fundamental form is process inheritance. On Linux systems, when a process spawns a child through fork or exec, the child inherits the parent's user identity and group memberships. Every permission the parent holds by virtue of that identity, the child holds too. This is how legitimate software operates. An application that needs to read files spawns worker processes that need the same access, and inheritance delivers it without explicit reassignment. The same mechanism is what makes CUID binaries a persistent and effective exploitation path. A binary with a CUID bit set executes with the permissions of the file's owner, not the permissions of the user who invoked it. If a CUID binary owned by root contains an exploitable vulnerability, the attacker who triggers it receives root permissions, not by compromising the root account, but by inheriting its permissions through the binary's execution context. The chain runs from file owner through the binary to the attacker. At no point did the file owner grant the attacker anything. In cloud environments, the propagation mechanism is role assumption. AWS IAM roles can be assumed by other principals. A trust policy on a role specifies which identities may assume it. If identity A can assume role B, and role B can assume role C, then identity A can reach role C's permissions in 2 steps. The original identity may have been created with minimal direct permissions. The assumption chain is what produces the effective access, and assumption chains are not always visible in the access review that covers direct role assignments. The Capital One breach follows this structure exactly. The attacker's access came from the EC2 instance's role, not from any identity she held in Capital One's IAM system. The instance was one link in the chain. The SSRF misconfiguration was what let her insert herself at the other end. Kubernetes environments extend this pattern to the container layer. Every pod in a Kubernetes cluster runs under a service account. When no service account is explicitly specified in the pod definition, the pod inherits the namespace's default service account. That default account carries whatever permissions were attached to it, permissions that were often added for a specific purpose by a specific team at a specific point in time and never revisited. Every pod deployed to that namespace inherits those permissions without any administrator explicitly granting them to those pods. The inheritance is automatic. The governance of what the default account carries is typically absent. In March 2025, a supply chain attack against the TJ Actions GitHub action demonstrated what CI/CD pipeline inheritance means under adversarial conditions. Malicious code was injected into the action, which over 23,000 repositories were using. When the compromised action ran inside a CI pipeline, it read the runner's process memory and printed what it found to the workflow logs: API keys, GitHub, personal access tokens, cloud credentials, private keys. The secrets were not stolen from a vault. They were not extracted through an authentication bypass. They were present in the runner's memory because they had been injected as environment variables from the pipeline's secret configuration. The malicious code simply read what the runner had inherited. The credentials were available to everything executing inside that environment, including code that had no business accessing them, because inheritance does not check intent. Across process trees, role assumption chains, Kubernetes service accounts, and C/CD runner environments, the structural failure is the same. Security teams govern the point of assignment. They review which roles exist, which accounts hold which permissions, which policies cover which resources. What they do not routinely govern is the propagation path, the distance between where a permission was placed and where it currently lives. The entity at the end of that chain was never part of the access review. It may not have a representation in the IAM system at all. Attackers do not need to compromise the identity that was explicitly granted access. They need to find an entity positioned at the receiving end of an inheritance chain from that identity. A process, a container, a runner, an EC2 instance, and a path to reach it. The access review may be entirely accurate. It is examining the origin. The permission is somewhere else.